18 And this a chapter of my expats, the bosses for whom I worked more or less continuously. They were different, some of them were funny in their own kind. Well, read on. English is my third language. My second was a Russian, which has long become my mother tongue to me, but up until I was 6 years old, when I, a little wild thing, got to a kindergarten, I didn't know a word in Russian. I started working professionally as a translator since 1995, when I was 30. Prior to this, my English was just a hobby. A complicated hobby. I dropped it many times and took it back again. Since high school. Sometimes I was the best in class, in school even. Then I would go down to being the worst. I passed it in my final exams with B when I totally lost interest in it again. But my teacher, for old time's sake, was very sympathetic to me, and she strongly recommended me to go to the Foreign Languages Institute. I didn't. I had started a new affair with my English in the army, in the second year of my service, when I accidentally came across a book about Robin Hood written in adapted English for the 7th grade of an English school in the Soviet Union. The book title was Arrows Against the Barons. In the course of the day, I would find some time to read through a chapter of this book, with each chapter scribbling down dozens of unfamiliar words, the translation of which I would find at the end of this book vocabulary. I was memorizing them. At nights before we go to sleep, I would retell this chapter in Russian. These were the kind of each night bedtime story episodes we had. This romantic period with my English dragged along for about 2 years. Dictionaries at the time were in short supply. I had some pocket dictionaries which were very truncated, no books could be read properly with any of them. I was able to get me the first good Muller's dictionary when I was in the North, in the year 1988, through good bookstore connections. But, with little feedback I had with all this, I started to cool down again to this my hobby, and that no hobby period lasted up until 1991, when I worked as a process pump operator and I needed something to kill my endless night shifts with benefits, so I turned back to English again. And never dropped it ever since. Maybe I just had no time for that, I guess. Somewhere after the year 1993 or later, I finally started to understand some of spoken English on radio or TV, or even the singers, what they were singing about. So, one day I thought that I knew English good enough to try to go to translate. I just wanted to look cool, to be admired for knowing how to speak English, for being able to interpreting what the rock groups were singing about. I wanted to be special. My brother-in-law, I guess, has given me a push. He had graduated the Piatigorsk Linguistic University, who came to the north and started to work as a translator in a first oil-producing joint venture in our region, and maybe even in this country. He also said my English was good. So he motivated me to try myself in this field. One of a Western service company needed an interpreter to fill in for 2 weeks. The pay was $20 a day, a fortune for us in those days. It was about my monthly salary in a normal Russian company where, in fact, they were late for about 6 months with the payment. That's where I saw my English was still far from being good. It sucked. I mean, I spoke tolerably well, but I almost did not understand any verbal English whenever I heard the others. However, 6 months later I was officially transferred from my pump operator to the translator position in the same company I had been working for. I just went to our HR and asked if the company needed any translators. They did. The newly founded department, that was procuring modern Western oil-producing equipment on the World Bank loans the company had just received, needed a translator. So I became a translator. And, shit, I was so proud of it. 18.1 Robert Stain. He was the first expat I worked for. He was a Canadian of a French origin. He represented the Rita Pumps, which is now owned by Schlumberger. So I went with him to the field and ESP bases, where he trained the Russian personnel to optimally operate and maintain the newly installed equipment. It was my first, but very useful English practice. My approach was, since I was going to be kicked out anyway, I should practice my English as long as I could. I could go back to run the pumps again if I should. But I made a good team with him. By the way, I was 30 years old already, not the best age to radically change the profession, and I tell you what, if you had not learned a second language by the time you are 25, fucking drop it. Keep that in mind. Especially now with the Google Translator service available, which keeps getting better. 18.2 Douglas. There was almost no drilling activity in this country in the mid-90s. Oil prices dropped down to a record $8 per barrel low. That was the reason the Soviet Union had collapsed, by the way, not Gorbachev, as our people still believe, and Putin keeps cultivating that myth. Similar collapse, perhaps, is going to happen to Russian Federation, and that may even occur with Putin still in power, but I personally believe, most likely, after him. Anyway, our contractors have prepared a rig to drill for us, and the Derrick Corporation shakers had been delivered for it. Douglas was a bona fide Scotsman from Aberdeen. He came for the installation of this equipment and to train our contractors' personnel, shift workers from Belarus. I had gotten used to his Scottish accent fast. More than that, at the beginning of my translating career my perception of his kind of English was even better than the normal ones. With him, I got some basic idea of how the drilling was working. When he was leaving, he asked my bosses if they would send someone to Aberdeen to work with him. Please keep me in mind first. That has never happened. 18.3 Buster. Overall I was coping good with my interpreting work, so I continued to work. In this company though, as elsewhere in Russia those days, they were holding back salaries for several months, so I regularly would either pay a visit or give a call to the joint venture, which pays were fantastic, and, most importantly, they were paying on time. But there wasn't any chance to get a job there. But, when I was about to give up all my attempts with, they right before the New Year Eve, during our corporate due, called me with the good news that after the holidays I could go to work. The company was hiring me. Wow! My boss, Mr. Fanin, the one who was cautious about taking me to work, he couldn't get out of my evasive answers during his interview, if I had a college degree or not, or if I had dropped out. Now he thought I was so good that he didn't want to let me go. The whole department begged him for me to let me go. They all knew how it was important to me. In the next company, probably to get me warmed up a little bit, they put me to the Canadian paramedics, where I worked for a week. That wasn't my particularly dream work, but I wasn't the one to faint at the sight of blood, and I translated for paramedics without losing much composure. I liked the joint venture. A week later I met with Buster, the workover superintendent. I had heard about him. He used to work before here, then he was gone for a long while, and now he was back again. That's where I come in. That's why they hired me. They said he had explosive behavior, like a real Irishman, especially from Louisiana, with their terrific English. And he was quick to fire. A typical Southerner. A bona fide redneck. I was frightened. Nobody seemed to like him much. He also reminded me of Gary Busey, the actor. He seemed to be okay to me. Yes, he was a Southerner all right. Yes, he was a racist a bit too, but it's a part of their aspiring Confederate mentality culture. Yes, he was a troglodyte anti-communist, but at the time it was massively welcomed. I do not like communists myself. Yes, he was suspicious of Russia as well. And, perhaps, he was religious too. It was fine with me. But I liked his straightforwardness. He wasn't a hypocrite. And he taught me how to drive a car. I did not have a driver's license back then. Remembering the state of my English back then, I understand what he must have been going through with me, patiently babysitting me. Yes, once in a while he'd lose his temper. But he hadn't kicked me out, and I was invariably drawn ready for this. So I made it through my first hitch. 6 months later I saw that I probably would stay there. Despite the strict prohibition in this company, drinking was allowed there before me coming along, but those days were long gone, and the zero-tolerance policy to alcohol had been introduced in the company territory. Some people still drank quietly. The particularly heavy drinker was my relief Sergei, a very good translator, by the way, the old high-quality Soviet school. They said that he also was a former KGB agent. I was not drinking at first, I was afraid, I had waited for this job for too long. Buster once invited me to a party. By the way, I would not say that he was drinking much. Maybe some beer once in a while. Thanks to him, I began to understand the Southerners perfectly well and had gotten to know what the damn workover was all about. 18.4 John Erickson. After Buster, once in a while we email letters. There were a few expats who have been coming for a couple of hitches, but they did not stay for long. There was an old man worked one hitch, the next hitch there was an ex-hippie, I think, he was imbued with the Woodstock spirit. Sometimes we would drink, after work hours, of course, and sing along with him playing the guitar the House of the Rising Sun or the Hotel California tunes. Then a lady from Moscow came to visit him. Must have been love. There was one guy I remember. He came from Texas. He sat at a corner all frightened. And he left us the very next day. Everyone was shocked by that, even the Americans. They called him a pussy. I do not know what he expected to see in the Russian wilderness. The golf clubs. And why the hell the company would pay them $1,000, or more. A day then? He was scared of our half-wild dogs, our local people. Then John came along from the White Knights, the very first joint venture in Russia, a very big guy from Texas who, before coming to Russia he barely heard of vodka, but when he tasted it he loved it so much he drank it whenever he had an excuse. On March 8, this is our Women's Day, he had his first booze with us and he flew off the handle and burglarized the toilet room to hell. Then the local management was scratching their heads what they should do with him. They couldn't just fire him, they just hired him, and besides, as it had turned out, it wasn't that easy to find somebody for this position. The guy before him just ran away. So, they left him alone. Shit happens. And our women in the company liked him. Especially when they learned that he and his wife were in the process of adopting a 6-month-old baby boy in our country. He was getting along with guys well too. In his first week in this company, a service company operator was fiddling with the equipment trying to crank it up, it wouldn't. John came close to him and asked him compassionately and without the slightest accent, "Pizdits." What meant fuck up in Russian. He was good to socialize with, and at work too, but very few Russian could outdrink him. He would send me home for the weekend with instructions to bring 5 bottles or so of Smirnoff vodka for him. It intended to be his weekly supply, but we would drink it all in one night after I have brought them. Next morning our workover contractor would bring him a bottle of cheap vodka to give him some pick-me-up and have him sign off all the workover operations completed. Well, they were not exactly completed, but, what the hell? He was good at returning thanks too. Russians adored him. One morning after a binge like this I came to work in somebody else's shoes. Once drunk, he had that rather a Russian trait. He would start to give away all his belongings. Clothes mostly. And the next day he wouldn't take them back. It would be understandable by the way if he did, especially from an American. People would bring it all back anyways. After a successful ending with the child adoption epic, he left us for another job, closer to his family and home. We exchanged our jackets, I still have his. Something of a well-known brand, I don't remember. Just like Schwarzenegger and Belushi characters in that Red Heat movie traded their wristwatches saying goodbye at the airport. I gave him my coat made in Russia which was too small on him. He was a good guy, the real Texan guy. 18.5 Glenn. After John, I worked with a lot of expats and companies, probably not long enough to remember them all. I worked for Joel, Tom, all were good professionals. Tom died of cancer. And then I worked with Glenn. One day a beautiful lady geophysicist called to the reception and asked to put him, though, I forgot his name, but he looks like an actor who is, I forgot his name too. The reception girl immediately got it right and put her through to him. and when I was told this story I immediately knew what an actor she had in mind. Clint Eastwood. He was well organized and reliable, he was good to work with. Some said he was arrogant. But who wasn't? I had seen the arrogant ones. He was okay. I did not notice him chasing the girls, and girls I knew adored him. Some of them would love to have him as a sugar daddy. The Clint Eastwood himself. There were some talks that he, despite being shorter than normal, was a very fit man. And I heard that he was good at fighting too. He sure looked like it. And he once confessed to me that he liked the Asian women. His next work was in Kazakhstan. 18.6 Ron. Unlike Glenn, my relationship with his back-to-back Ron was not immediately good. He, compared to reliable Glenn, seemed to be a little twitchy, constantly changing his mind. He was giving me a lot of hell at first. But, as is often the case in nature and the economy, not the fittest or best survive but the luckiest. VHS vs Betamax, MP3 vs Attrack, Humanoids vs Real Predators, all enjoyed working with Glenn, but Ron stayed instead. He turned out to be a good guy. He had done some good things for me. He has lobbied a good salary for me, for one thing. He had the company pay for my driver's school, claiming that the company will only benefit with a translator capable driving vehicles, rather than hiring yet another driver. He also had gotten me a brand new laptop. He offered me to go with him to his new project. I was not sure if my decision was right, and the management tried to discourage me, but I went with him anyway. Who knows, I may still be working at this company if I hadn't gone. But no regrets. I was working with him, I easily made good money, and, in a year, I made enough to buy me a really good car. Never ever money have been that good for me, peaking up to $12,000 a month once. And it was in 2004, by the way, when a $500 a month was considered to be a good salary in Russia back then. Then he took a job in a big oil producing company, a huge joint venture operator in Russia. After a year and a half I left this company too. The same joint venture had hired me. 18.7 Larry, a good old man. A real field supervisor. A driller. But he's probably the only one with whom I had fights couple of times. It happened. For example, he'd tell me to get some information on a well that never existed, and I tried to tell him that something must be wrong with that well number, but he wouldn't even listen to me. I don't care. Just do what you're told. That's it. He didn't care. Somehow, I was able to explain to him that no such well ever existed. But to their credit, they know how to admit mistakes and apologize. Our bosses would never do that. 18.8 Keith, this one was our kind of a guy. Even before he was in Russia, he already knew the words abyss. They all, by the way, love that word. I know one expat, who, at his interpreter girl's suggestion, drives his Corvette in Dallas with a words abyss written on his license number plate. When that Keith came along in the company, it was on a corporate party. The first word he said to a lady, the translator sitting down next to her, was the words abyss. He was a man of well over 50, he was a drinker, chased women too. Whenever he flew to home he tried to stop at Amsterdam for a day or two, and of every other week at work I, like a pimp, had to arrange him a girl. I found a local agency called Elite Massage, where, they said, they had beautiful models from Ekaterinburg working part-time in their agency. The girls, in fact, looked fantastic, all tanned and tall. They looked like models all right. There was, his favorite one, Kate, who spoke English. I knew Keith had a beautiful wife, I saw her on his pictures he showed. And he himself looked great for his almost 60. He was a good guy. But he must be missing something since he loved women so much. 18.9 Mark I had no direct and permanent bosses in that big oil producing company. I would go to the fields with different specialists. I also translated for different people in the office, at meetings and conferences. Mark was our department boss. I knew him since that joint venture where I was working for Buster. It was he who hired me now. And the money was good. Mark, I must say, was now a big boss, and I treated him properly with my enforced subordination. Especially since I knew how ambitious he was and how important were these bossy attributes to him. No talks about drinking bouts we used to have long before. These things are painful to them. No familiarity. So I kept a proper distance with him. He was a good boss. His department was doing quite good, as far as it was possible under the circumstances. Khodorkovsky was in jail already, but the overall investment climate was still much better than it is today. New technologies were introduced in the company along with standards, the culture of production and ethics, and the whole company was benefiting from it. For him, being a good boss still, nothing human was alien to him. He liked to party, enjoyed delicious food and women. With women, it was quite mutual. He still looked great. And everything was under his control. Despite this huge joint venture legal status, with its odd shares distribution, 50-50, which regularly caused some difficulties for the board, the company kept squeezing out expats from all levels of management. With each regular restructuring of the company, Mark's power was curtailed. By the time I got transferred from translators to the chief specialist position, I would say his power was getting further from being real, as of a weddings general. He still puffed up in public, but everyone saw the real state of things, and he began to drink quietly at work. However, women still loved him. Frankly, I do not know how he managed to keep the situation under control. He seemed to be married in America but has lived as a resident working in Russia. His assistant was madly in love with him, but he was seeing another one who was pregnant already. By the way, that was the same beauty, who asked her to connect to Clint Eastwood once. He arranged a good position in Moscow for his assistant, and shacked up with the other girl. They had a son. Then another one. I respected him for this fact alone. In spite of the fact that when our department was disbanded and I got laid off, he was acting disgustingly towards me. He wanted to fire me the way they do it in America. I told him to read our labor codes first, and I knew my rights and I was going to get everything I was entitled to by this code. Understood? I was to work for 2 more months after the staff reduction announcement and going to get my compensation and getting paid my salaries with benefits for the next 6 months. But still he didn't dump his girlfriend with his kids. I could not help projecting things over. I would not dump a girl with babies either. This is not the case of morality and religiosity. 0, zip, nothing. I just wouldn't do it. A couple of years later I found out when he was asked to leave the company, he did dump them. They came back from vacation. And he wasn't there. And he had left no contacts. No way to get in touch with him. And he had good friends. Nobody had turned him in. Good for them. I am not a trendy person, I never have followed the crowd. It's fashionable now to be religious in Russia or dislike the Americans. And I am not religious, and I mostly fine with America. The most innovative and powerful country in the world, and this country in general provides pretty high standard of living for its citizens. Well, I don't have the trendy iPhone by the way, but I do have this approach: put your pants on or take your cross off. I am not saying if you are whoring around, you should divorce. No way. It happens to everyone. But if you have ended up with kids, be liable for that for God's sake. However, I still hope that he quietly supports them financially. He never seemed to look like a gone guy to me. 18.10 Dan, he was my big boss. He took me as a chief specialist and was happy with me. When the company started squeezing out the expats, I realized that with my boss gone I wouldn't be staying there much longer. It always has been better for me to work with expats. For them, it still matters how you were at work more than who are your friends or relatives. 18.11 John, after disbanding of that huge company department, I was reprofiled back to translating and went to work for a small oil-producing company. Just went public and found Western investors who believed in this company bright future. John was a driller. He and I used to work in a previous service company. He was a short and nondescript guy, but the translator girls adored him. Yes, he was a really good person to work with. He was unperturbed and patient. A convinced Yankee, a northerner that is, a Democrat and a liberal if you will. I had never heard him speaking unequivocally low of anybody. He was being sarcastic though. There was one expatriate he immediately took a dislike. He was a good driller, has drilled everywhere except Antarctica. He had a noticeable trait though, he always repeated his questions. It was maddening sometimes. Maybe he was just being meticulous. One more thing. If during the conversation with him somebody says they, he was sure to ask again, who they? I mean, it was always clear to the rest who were they. But this was nothing. John, if you suddenly reading this, please do not be offended. We all remember you and you were cool. You were a good boss and a wonderful professional and a great person too. John was the only guy who gave this company 4 translators, including me. He worked in Kazakhstan after this company. I hope he is doing good. 18.12 Randy was the one whom John immediately disliked. That was mutual. He was big, like a Viking, like an Ice Age Cro-Magnon guy. He was the most colorful expat I worked with. He was a construction guy, a professional gold digger, a mechanic of a broadest profile and a man of wide reading. On his way to the field, he would tell us about the mechanism of dominant and recessive genes passing down through generations, or about how the ancient Egyptian writings were decrypted, thanks to the found Rosetta Stone code-breaking artifact. Just imagine an American from Alaska, the working man, and Mendel's laws. Huh. And he was also a polyglot. He knew about 7 European languages and he was mastering very aggressively and with some noticeable success for his age. He was well over 50, the Russian language. He was one of those movers and shakers, like one of Jack London's story's characters. Normally people with their kind of drive are very hard to keep in check. There was no peace with him around. He was a daydreamer. The main motivation he had was to make life better. That's what he was claiming when he came here. But the Russians did not really seem to be happy with his way making their lives better. Well, first of all, no one can change the mentality of people right on the move. All the construction industry was built on 70s GOST, all Union State, standards here in Russia, which of course were hopelessly out of date, but there were no other rules and standards to follow. And this country is known to be very bureaucratic, and this bureaucracy performance was terribly bad. The CEO himself was Randy's friend and a countryman from Alaska who had hired Randy and assigned him to run the construction in this company. And he was running it all right. He naively, which is generally characteristic to those who just came to work in Russia, would start to build the roads, platforms for transformers and other objects the way he was building them in Alaska. He was going to build them fast, for a full due and to his common sense. My ass. What about our all-union standards? If the regulations say that the piles should be driven for the transformer platforms no matter how small are they will do that? No matter that Randy vehemently was saying that it many times increased the cost of construction. Such were the regulations. Or, the company bought expensive Volvo construction equipment. Sure, you cannot keep such expensive equipment staying idle. Take an excavator to the site. No trailer available. When will it be available? Well, tomorrow, maybe. Then Randy gets to it himself and drives a tracked excavator on his own. It needs to be there. Russian folks are panicking. Driving it in such a cold temperature to such a distant construction site, it surely can cause the excavator undercarriage transmission breakdown, and its repair will cost a fortune and will take forever. It is still better to wait a day for a trailer. And that kind of mentality difference and approaches were on everything. Very destructive, neither side backing down. Once the contractor's drivers came looking for a construction department's head to have their trip ticket signed. And the head was raking out the gravel brought to the company parking lot driving a Western Bobcat loader. Drivers thought I was kidding. I had personally to show them from a conference room's window. Then Randy came in, signed all the papers, went back to his gravel. Then his wife Shauna came along with him. She was a slim and good-looking woman. She looked like she was 25 years old, if not younger, when, in fact, she was 10 years older. In a local supermarket where she was buying a souvenir Yugra vodka, I jokingly asked her if she had any ID on her, saying that she was 21 years old, so we had no trouble with a checkout clerk. She seriously said that in America, she still had been asked for those IDs. And she had 5 kids. One day I went to show her the town where we stayed. We walked around the local shops, popped over a local hairdresser. Before leaving the parlor, I told that this lady I was with, in fact, was an American lady. Everyone who was in there shuddered back to life and dropped what they were doing and surrounded her. The point was, the locals had gotten used to expats, but no one had seen any expat women yet in the middle of nowhere. So they clustered around her, watching her as if she was an alien and excitedly asking her questions. How did you like it here? What are you doing here? Where are you from? And I was thinking to myself that they didn't know she had 5 kids. Now they have 6. Well done, Randy. Come down here to Siberia in 5 or 10 years. Everything will be different. We may still work together as a team. But in this company, you and Don, especially Don, will be remembered as the inadequate tyrants there, the whip crackers. Sorry about that. In the nearest future, it would be better for you all to stay out of this area a bit. Let them forget you. P.S. In August 2015 I received a letter from Shauna, where she wrote to me that she had just given birth to her 7th baby, a big cute boy named Riddick. His full name was Riddick Finn Elliott. Hey Shauna and Randy. Congratulations. Well done. That's the way it should be. 7 cute kids. 18.13 gram to be brief is what we say very metaphorically in Russia about people like him. I wouldn't go scouting with him, meaning I didn't rely on him a bit. It wasn't clear for me what he, being pathologically cautious, hen-hearted even, was doing in Russia anyway. I know the pay was good. Still, the people of his kind have a tendency of increased victimhood. These are more likely to be taken as a hostage and get killed in the first place. Well, some just don't like his guts. I also would not advise him to go to a polar expedition with someone ever if he wants to live much longer. He wasn't a very bright person, interested in nothing but hockey. At a party though, a drunken old woman crazily confessed of love to him at a burst of applause. Remembering Graham, I thought of Canadians with whom I worked in a pipeline company, and there was a phenomenon what drew my attention. When I, the hard-boiled egg, watched their enthusiasm, the gleam in their eyes, they had been acting at work with, vigorously discussing emerging issues or making new proposals to save the employer's money. Such an enthusiasm we had lost by the 70s in this country, and I personally did not catch it out at our works. I couldn't believe in their sincerity. I was sure they kept watching each other and therefore showing off a lot and squealing on each other, they benefiting of their mentality that allowed them to do this. Thus they're acting out to keep their jobs, because it sucks without a job even in Canada, and it's really challenging to get a good job in Canada. Obviously, it all works for the system, for its stability. There is another thing. Personally, I wouldn't have been surprised if it came to the third-generation Anglo-Saxons with their fucking Protestant ethics, or to the Southeast Asia immigrants with their traditional cult of labor only. Those immigrants from Ukraine and Russia are getting infected with this as well. Only 1 out of the 4 Canadians working in the pipeline company was an Anglo-Saxon, and the rest were the Ukrainians of the first and second generations. Not that I don't like this. What I don't like is the North American showing off culture. Ethics, if you will. If you're doing your best at work, do it fucking quietly, as the Japanese/Korean/Chinese would. And your work will be rated by the consumers, voting with their cash. Period. Watching the Canadians, I unwittingly found myself thinking that I had seen all of this somewhere. Where? And then, boom. That was our Soviet Komsomol activists acting this way at school, at work sometimes, but it was gone mostly by the late Soviet era. Same attitude, same simulated enthusiasm, this notorious shine in the eyes I wrote about. All that I hated in our Komsomol activists, this histrionic showing off motivations. Those of our Komsomol leaders showing such zeal in hope to get some credit for that, like a recommendation for a prestigious university, etc. We did not like them for their hypocrisy and flattery. Yes, we are indeed different, for Canadians, and the USA citizens for that matter, this is a part of their mentality. 18.14 Robert one day, discussing yet another fiscal impasse, to what they all had put the company to, with Graham, he came up to me saying with his keen sarcasm, "You really don't care about it? Do you?" I said nothing. He was right, I didn't care. It would have been worse for him if I did. Not that he was a bad person. He was the right kind of a Southerner. Well, he was arrogant, all right, that's typical for a Southerner with an "I am doing you a fucking favor helping to get that crude oil for your" attitude, and costing a company as a whole department of his Russian counterparts to do him his favor to us. Still, everything in him was more or less in the right proportion. Well, I saw in him a well-hidden KKK guy who probably still remembered how his parents used to lynch Negroes. It's because of guys like him America is widely hated in the world. Okay, I am getting carried away myself. Calm down, boy. Anyway, he wasn't that bad guy for a Confederate at all, but his age was beginning to tell. At that age, unless you're Armand Hammer or something, it's better to go. Right under his nose, an uneducated but quirky woman, who was running the company's construction department for him, would enter into contracts for the construction works with her very own construction company, which she hastily had re-registered to her daughter then, without any competition. An obvious conflict of interest. And he knew that in fact he had advised her to re-register that company to her daughter. And that was happening to a public company which shares were being traded in London Stock Exchange. If he didn't care about this, why should I? Where the world is heading to. Those much vaunted Western managers pretty much have recreated a little Russia in the company with its total incompetence, theft, and corruption. This woman was causing irritation among the many, but Robert stubbornly kept her to himself. Worse was with his translator. I simply feel sorry for these bosses having such cunning, immoral and manipulative translator who was also going off the deep end. Yes, that was the most abnormal one you read above, the knocked off version of the ripe fruit, the failed kind of Emmanuel, who was looking for herself in religion and in Russian literature of the 19th century. In fact, they were a perfect match for each other. The translator was telling me, yes, that very night when she, naked, was reading me that so much loved Dostoevsky, she was telling and writing me, for that matter, a lot of the company inside information, about Robert plotting and actively taking part in the company coup attempt against his boss Don. She was explaining to me what she was whispering about with the guys behind the closed door. Well, you remember what I mean. This portraits Robert's reliability as a team player. If you disagree with your boss, go ahead, speak up openly, but never conspire against your boss. Julia has turned out to be her boss's worthy fast learner. You know what she had done to me while I was sick. Okay then. To everyone who is reading this. If you are going to do business in Russia, please keep this in mind. Don't at least act in Russia as Robert did. I know that Russians are not angels. I was shocked with Russians during the Crimean hysteria myself. I even hated Russians as an ethnic group after what they had done to the Malaysian Boeing. Yes, I fucking hated them. But sanctions will be lifted sooner or later. Maybe Russia will disappear, but the Russians will stay, and they have their dignity too. And, when you get to Russia, and I know that you will, please forget that favorite phrase of yours, we are here to help you. Americans especially, I never heard Brits saying that, not even Canadians. Never fucking say it. Who has launched the first man into the space, for crying out loud? We are here to help you. You damned philanthropists. We are all really tired of your messianic, patronizing behavior of guys like Robert. Please think about it when you come here. 18.15 And finally, this one is about this great and terrible one, as some would call him, Don. He was this company's CEO. He was well known in some circles. He claimed to have turned around the Yuko's company as we knew it in its glory days for Khodorkovsky himself before he got arrested. Maybe, I don't know. I heard some caustic comments behind his back on this though, even from people directly reporting to him. Anyway, when he took over this small company, it just went public and he vigorously started to turn it around. I tried to stay away from him. What the heck? I was afraid of him. At one meeting, when the two interpreters had already been exhausted and I saw there was no place to go to, I had to take the torch. So I took over and started to translate. There were about 70% of the staff and the entire management team at the meeting. I knew they spoke perfect English, the rest, I suspect, knew English to some degree too, and the CEO himself spoke tolerably good Russian. So I translated and he, the boss, was not overly burdened by the tact. In front of everybody asked his deputy, a young and handsome technical director who had studied for several years in Scotland, the one, by the way, who had allegedly stolen $26 million from the company, if I was adequately translating for him. The technical director focused up and I, still continuing to translate, stiffened. Had he said no or something like that and I, in front of everybody, would immediately be put away from this meeting. I went on, feeling by my back that the technical director nodded okay to the boss and saved my reputation and, possibly, my job. When I exhausted, passed the torch to a pretty lady to translate, and immediately the technical director, now very focused and on alert, caught her on some inaccurate translation. She had translated a word truck as a tractor purely because of that verbal attunement. Not fucking big deal, for what she immediately got her ass kicked by the CEO. Jesus Christ. What am I going to do with my damn translators? I avoided him at lunch, because I knew that he would ask me some questions like what I would think about those possible building contractors with whom he had just been negotiating and I was there translating for him. Shall they go for the resource cost for their services, or they are going to stick to the turnkey job? He never liked the translators, those damn non-profits, and he always wanted to find them some better use. In many previous companies I was constantly reminded me of my place, that I should never interfere with my opinion. You are a translator, just do what you need to do, stay put, and don't bring up anything. And this one always was eyeing you, wanting to know what you had to say. Normally I had nothing. That's the way I had been trained, to watch my mouth. I said, by the way, about the builders that they would stick to their old tested schemes, the turnkey works, that was not good for us. I knew, of course, but, apparently, we had no choice. That had proved to be true. At the meetings, he could with annoyance interrupt my seemingly flawless translation and lecture me in front of everybody on how I should be translating. You interpret, not translate. You were at that meeting, you should remember all that. I did not dare to talk back to him, to explain that whenever I translate, I don't remember anything, and the better I translate, the less I remember. And his interpreters, they were more than just translators, they were his assistants. They were authorized to make many million rubles deals, what Randy hated so much. They know shit about it. He grumbled, what is he thinking having them make those multimillion deals? But the CEO trusted them. That's what he wanted from the rest of his employees, not just stupid execution of his wills, that was going without saying, but that they were the participants, the decision-making units too. 1 month was particularly heavy for me. We have started several new drilling rigs and contracted a new drilling company. One new rig was coming, and yet another company was getting ready too. I also drove the car for my direct boss and for different cases and assignments. It wasn't in my job description, but, what the heck, money was good, and when my boss went home, I was transferred to the building department, to Randy again, where the rate of new construction site start UPS was even higher and this department operations were even less organized. Construction specifics and terminology were completely different for me. Dump trucks loaded with crushed stones were coming and drivers yelling where they should dump it to. There was no time to call and find out and no communications anyway. It was necessary to make decision. And you take responsibility at your own risk. Each unit should take a decision. When Randy went home to his gold mines, I was told that the CEO was coming and he would be here for the whole week to speed up the commissioning of some critical facilities before the next shareholder meeting. That meant endless visits, briefings, meetings with all kind of contractors. And I would have to translate for all this. Thank God he brought along one of his assistants whom I just loved. He had 2 assistants, each in their own way, were these Russian beauties and real professionals too, but this one, as I already had said, I just was adoring. Her translations sounded just like a song to my ears. I must have been listening to her too intently. She, while translated, suddenly would give me such a warm smile when the CEO was dead serious. He was good at being funny too when he wanted, and the people would readily laugh at him anyway even if his jokes were not that funny, so I would unwittingly start to think that she was flirting with me. And she must have been smiling just out her shyness. She thought I was a good translator and she might feel a little bit uneasy to translate in front of me. Despite her being very helpful, I still had enough of work. Mostly I was translating for the boss for the first half of a day, and she would do it for the rest. The most vulnerable and least favorite area for me was geophysics, and when I with my CEO flew into this area I had to apply brakes, to frantically pick up the right terms still trying to keep up with my boss tempo, and the boss, who didn't like any slowing down, and when I stopped again for the right word, he would, with a head and slowly, repeat the sentence. If it didn't work, then he with his obvious irritation, would switch to his broken Russian, going like that's the way you should say, damn it. Sometimes, in front of all English-speaking personnel, he would go like, Jesus Christ, Radek, do it. Will you? I will say it faster in Russian, God damn it. What happened here was that I was no longer fearing him. I was no longer avoiding him. I almost without any effort, was sharing with him my ideas and concerns. I was even liking it when he was listening to me. And, finally, I had the confidence that I probably would be working in this company for a while. On the day of his departure, he thanked me for my good work and apologized for keeping me there after my hitch was over. For God's sake, boss. It was my pleasure to work for you. He was a good manager to me. Despite his authoritarianism, he still encouraged all level of initiatives. But something kept going wrong. He wanted all and fast, but the company production, in spite of everything, didn't grow. Instead of being turned around, it kept going upside down, and the board has finally fired him. It is still a puzzle to me, how come he had turned around the giant yuccos and failed with this small Russian company. I would never know, since he looked smart to me. Apparently, his basic mistake was that he, without addressing the main problems in this company first, like weeding out of theft, conflict of interests and other Russian business typical shortcomings that were eating up this company, he like a cowboy took to turn it around to an advanced Western company. It just doesn't work this way. Not even in Russia. To me, it should be obvious to a manager of his level. With endless financial resources, it may still get to, say, the Sochi Olympics or something. But with limited resources, he naturally ended like Gorbachev looking to face his Soviet Union collapse. Unfortunate country. All the talented ones are almost gone here, and those of remained ones just keep running away. While, since the beginning of Peter the Great's time, some shady Western characters and all sorts of gold-digging adventurers are coming here to help us. Whenever I hear Oscar Benton's Bensonhurst blues tune, I always remember him. By the way, the young Oscar Benton even looked like Don. A mystery of some sort. In general, people with an exaggerated ego like his, are unfortunate people. They have neither rest to themselves nor to people surrounding them. So was my father, the same thing was going with Don. You can believe me, he is having really hard going through this failure of his. I hope that he is not at least taking to drink, they normally would in situations like this. I know what I am writing about. I am that sick Narcissus motherfucking asshole myself with an overblown and unsatisfied ego. A little while after I left this company I came across an article about him on the internet. He turned up in the top 10 of worst managers in Russia in 2013. And he was the worst of this top 10. Here's what was written about him: change of capitalization, of the company he was running, author's note, since January 7, 2012 is 80.6%. It's no accident Don Wolcott was the worst in the capitalization fall for this year. The major shareholders' conclusion came out faster than the CEO's rating drop. July 10, Tom Reed replaced sacked Wolcott. Someone just had to be beheaded, no joke. The company's capitalization has fallen 5 times in a year. Ruspetro problem is in its huge debt of $300 million, the service of which would cost $40 million a year in the absence of a coherent production and thus the cash flow. And the top management still said that the company needed a new partner as if already spent money was not enough. Poor Don. I also thought that, how long had it taken for Putin to become a monster? About 15 years of unlimited power? And Don came along as a monster already. Imagine what he would have become if he had done anything right in Ruspetro. Anyway. It's good to be retired with nothing to be scared about and writing this novel and getting paid for it too. 18.16 Jim, I am not a guardian, it's a kind of a guy. I wouldn't have written this book if I was. I had enough already for the chapter about this fucked up girl alone. I don't know yet how much more trouble will bring me this book, if it ever sees the light. What could I say about Jim? I'm not a racist. I mean, recognizing the ethnic group rights to their identities, I never push those subjects around. Neither do I pay much attention to them. There is neither Helen nor the Jews for me. Period. However, it always has been better for me to work with British guys rather than Americans and especially Canadians. Brits always had something with them. Was it their natural politeness, nobility, or something else I would never know. Jim was Welshman though looked a bit like young Churchill. He had that Shrek's accent and complexion. And same charm as well. It was a pleasure working with him. When we had our last, and very expensive, dinner together, Jim thanked me for the work, said how good it was working with me, especially compared to a girl worked for him right before me who was on maternity leave now. I had an itch to tell him about that interpreter who had destroyed my career but fought it back. But when he, relaxed, complained to me about his vision not getting any better for his borderline diabetic conditions, I couldn't hold it anymore and told him about Julia. I knew that he had known her. He said that he had never liked her. Yes. Mark, his pal, didn't like her either. Had there not been a more stable job coming I waited for so long, I would have stayed with Jim. With him both, the money was good and he was great to work with. Although I was unpleasantly surprised to learn what an outspoken anti-Semite he was. I didn't know that British people were so insecure as well. Nothing human was alien to him. We had a good time once with whores in a sauna with a swimming pool, for what he generously paid by the way. 18.17 Alex Fleming. My first expat Douglas was a Scottish guy. This one for whom I worked at Weatherford, sometimes I did not understand at all. Especially when he spoke fast. Maybe it was just me, so unaccustomed to his Scottish version of English. Once in a morning meeting, I said so to all, I couldn't understand his English. I just needed a bit of the time to get used to him. Alex was a walking example of a hog-wild beer consumption, his stomach and puffy face clearly spoke for themselves. But it wasn't the company people didn't like him for, it was for his real tedious persistence, although in general, he was coping with his maintenance manager rather well. 18.18 Larry, he was Alex's back-to-back. An American. A Southerner. Kinda was sweet on Putin, so because of that we had some few rather heat but still quite constructive arguments. All treated Larry better than Alex. I like him too. He was an unflappable and stress-proof kind of a guy. We worked well and good. When I said I quit because I was offered a much better job in the Philippines with its salary 3 times larger I was making here at Weatherford, I saw he got a bit disappointed, but he let me go without a problem, but said I had to finish my last hitch at least. We parted friends. That's it, just felt an urge to write about all my expat bosses. Asterisk. In conclusion, I would like to say a few words about us, the translators. We are endangered professionals. I'm sure that after 10 years we as the translators will not be needed anymore. We'll be gone. This Google Translator keeps getting better all along. I mean 10 years later, its efficiency will grow not just by many times but by many orders better. It will be capable to instantly and adequately translate any poems. And be in virtually any kind of tiny devices implanted in the ears if not in a brain. So don't waste your time on learning a second or a third language. Do something more useful with your life. Believe me, if I, having spent 10 years just to master English to make it my profession, say this, I probably have the reason for this. I have so many years to this my profession, so I can do nothing else for a living. I have mixed feeling to my interpreting profession. I hate it sometimes. I tried to change my profession but nobody would hire an inexperienced engineer, an unexperienced anything. Now I have with the same frenzied persistence to get out of this translating busyness as I once came, without any experience by the way, to it. And one more thing to those who still want to dedicate their lives to this dubious profession, this job could be interesting too. There are a lot of things in it, but there is one thing it lacks for sure: stability. A quarter of my translating career I was unemployed. My wife told me once when she was still young, she was taking our little daughter from the kindergarten, the daughter, simply told her teacher and the parents around that her mom and dad were both out of job. They left quickly. Who knows, if I survive all this, in my old age, I may start writing books in English. English seems to be my undying love.